When the Worship Associates team asked me to take the pulpit on this date, the date we remember and celebrate the work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I was ecstatic because Martin Luther King is one of my American heroes. That ecstasy lasted about 24 hours. Then a strange feeling, a sense of apprehension, confusion began to pervade my thoughts. And this was more than just nerves. What should I talk about? Recent events have ignited explosive discussions about racism, discrimination, hate, and violence, provoking many to civil disobedience, others to thoughtful discussion, love, compassion. Marvin Gaye's soul classic, What's Going On, a pensive song reflecting on the turbulent 60s, seemed to speak as much now as then. Should I address our progress in these 50 years since Selma and take an optimistic tone? Or should I address our lack of progress, the continuing fight for social justice, and try to put a positive spin on this? Or I could try to make meaning of recent events in Ferguson and many other incidents around the nation. But as I began to peel away the layers of possible topics, I came to a core definition. If we're to understand racism and begin to unpack its ugly history, we must first define it. Because defining racism defines our attitudes and our reactions to racism. Defining racism is the key to understanding racism. But who holds this magic key to definition? Does the dictionary have the authority? Well, I'm certain Merriam-Webster would lay claim to that. A belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. In short, racial prejudice or discrimination. Well, it's a start. The dictionary provides a clear denotation which lacks any connotations, and therein lies the rub. And no, this is not going to be an English teacher lecture today. It's not so academic because we all come to racism from different perspectives. What are our stories as individuals? Where did we grow up? What kind of homes were we raised in? Is racism inherent in us, a socio-biological phenomenon, or is it a learned behavior? We know it exists, but how we define it, that's just a little trickier. The word itself has only been around about 150 years, coined from the French word racine, but the concept has been with us since the dawn of man. Ultimately, we must look beyond the dictionary because racism engulfs our culture. And all of us see it a little differently. Surely, Martin Luther King has the authority to define racism. I've certainly pondered what he might have to say about recent events and civil unrest in our nation, although I think we would all agree that he would be saddened, and perhaps saddened to see as well that progress in today's fight against racial injustice has indeed been slow. And it has become abundantly clear that we have work ahead. As we find ourselves at the 50th anniversary of Selma, we look to Martin Luther King as an authority and a guide. And we read his words as an inspiration to our souls and our rational minds. In this revealing anecdote, it is clear he began to put the pieces of racism together at a very young age. These are King's words. My mother, as the daughter of a successful minister, had grown up in comparative comfort. She had been sent to the best available school and college and had, in general, been protected from the worst blights of discrimination. But my father, a sharecropper's son, had met its brutalities at first hand and had begun to strike back at an early age. I remembered riding with him one day in my childhood when he accidentally drove past a stop sign. A policeman pulled up to the car and said, "All right, boy, pull over and let me see your license." My father replied indignantly, "I'm no boy." Then, pointing to me, "This is my boy. I'm a man. And until you call me one, I will not listen to you." The policeman was so shocked that he wrote the ticket up nervously and left the scene as quickly as possible. With this heritage, it is not surprising that I had learned to abhor segregation, considering it both rationally inexplicable and morally unjustifiable. Well, racism is certainly being defined by example for the young MLK. Like many of King's words, these are loaded with implications. He learns he is considered different, but is perhaps not sure why. He learns that language has implications, although he may not fully understand them. He notices this makes the policeman nervous. And as he reflects on the experience as an adult, he makes the most salient observation that the incident was both rationally inexplicable and morally unjustifiable. Rationally inexplicable and morally unjustifiable. Words we live with today. What is striking about this statement is its keen observation that racism cannot be rationally explained or morally justified. Again, I think most of us, UUs, would agree with King's assertions, but certainly not everyone in history. Certainly not everyone today. If King were alive in today's culture, I wonder what he would make of the media influence on this issue. Does the media have the authority to define racism for us? Certainly, it is defined in countless media outlets. In fact, this nonstop information overload can be overwhelming, confusing, contradictory, downright befuddling. Countless writers, from academics to journalists, philosophers to politicians, and novelists to poets, have all taken a turn defining racism in their own words. Add the power of imagery to these words, and the definitions become a little clearer. If you've seen these movies, you will remember them. Guess who's coming to dinner? Crash and Gran Torino spin racism in a contemporary culture. While Roots and 12 Years a Slave slapped slavery right in the face, movies like Driving Miss Daisy, Imitation of Life, 42, and the just-released Selma offer us various cultural and sociological views and interpretations of racism. Far too many television shows have taken on the issue to begin naming them, but those of Norman Lear, particularly the groundbreaking Mother of them All in the Family, with its racist protagonist, Archie Bunker, became household names when the 70s ushered in a new era of racial commentary into the living rooms of America. Talk radio is notorious for its slanderous commentary. Today's high-speed internet with its endless stream of information and countless social media venues perhaps define racism for us both explicitly and implicitly more than any other force in today's culture. Social media and the internet are just frightening, overwhelming. While these avenues provide an open window for discussion, those discussions circling around the globe provide a few too many perspectives, making it difficult and confusing to sort out bias, intent, and propaganda. Want a more personal perspective? Try striking up a discussion on racism at your next family function. Or maybe while waiting in line at the grocery store. No. It's not an easy topic to talk about. Discussing the wonderful direction and acting in 12 Years a Slave is not the same conversation as discussing how 12 Years a Slave reveals and defines the roots of racism in this country. A word of warning: if you find yourself in a discussion on racism, expect to find in these sometimes real and sometimes hypothetical situations and discussions a quick disregard for factual history and reasoned argument. Oh yes, logic. And where does it go in these discussions? Perhaps this is what King meant by racism being irrational and morally unjust. Take a look at this spin on reasoned thinking. This billboard, sponsored by none other than the Ku Klux Klan, welcomes visitors to Harrison, Arkansas. Now, I went to college in the Ozarks, I admit it. I have friends and family in Northwest Arkansas who would be horrified by this billboard. But clearly, for some in the region, this does define racism. For innocent and naive children who may be confused, their parents will explain this logic to them. But unfortunately, it won't be the same explanation the young Martin Luther King received from his father. In our fast-paced and multi-ethnic culture, we are bombarded with words and images on a continual basis. Mentally sorting through this information and making sense of it is a monumental task. To complicate matters even more, the commentary on and interpretations of racism through the media, good propaganda or bad, brings up unbelievably complicated questions about free speech. The recent incident in Paris, just one more example. Everyone in this room, I think, understands this and would agree. This issue is complicated. Does science have the authority to define racism? A recent article in Mother Jones titled "The Science of Your Racist Brain" offers an interesting perspective. Neuroscientist David Amiato posits that a small region of the brain, the amygdala, reacts when we see those of a different race, and that reaction is fear-based, a sort of biological defense mechanism. Coined implicit racial bias by psychologists, the tentacles of this hidden racism can affect interpersonal behavior, policies, employment practices, even public life. Studies, tests, and the subsequent conclusions reveal that the amygdala may cause us to, and I want to make a clarification here, that these are subconscious behaviors that we may ourselves not even be aware of. This little pesky thing in the brain, this little pink spot here, could cause us to associate skin color with physical rather than mental abilities of people. It may cause us to maintain a physical distance due to race. It may even be subjecting us to bias at the doctor's office. It is said that subconsciously people did not vote for Barack Obama because of this pesky little brain thing. At its core, this theory seems to imply that biologically we have an innate fear and an inherent need for survival. Biologically, we are all racist. And consequently, we spend our lives in a quest for racial equality against biological odds. But Amadeo is also clear on this point. We have the capacity to control both our fear and our behavior. Many sitting in this congregation today participated in this online discussion, and I was brought to tears reading many of your thoughtful reflections. But I could not bring myself to the point of calling myself a racist, although I certainly understood the arguments. I have faith in science, and I'm willing to admit I have moments when I simply cannot understand why I might have had a questionably racist thought, or perhaps uttered a questionably racial epithet. Does this generation have the authority to define racism? I can assure you, I have learned a great deal from working with teenagers the past 27 years. Not to mention my parents and grandparents, whose behavior and words were more often racist than not. And we've come a long ways. Hopefully, most discussions of racism are evolving discussions, revealing growth, compassion, understanding, at least in an ideal world. I teach a classic novel. I'm betting 90%, maybe more, of you have read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Yes, that one. Mark Twain's biting satire on the failures of Reconstruction and the emotional wreckage of slavery are not without controversy, something Twain would surely relish today. Considered one of the most frequently banned books in high school curriculums, Twain boldly employs the word nigger 219 times. Oh yes, it's been counted. Bold now, not so bold then, when the novel was dished for its lack of proper grammar. Well, not being a fan of censorship, I have been careful over the years in the introduction of this novel. I've covered my tracks and prepared my defenses, but that defense has changed in the course of just a few years. In 2002, when Harvard professor of Black Studies Randall Kennedy published his book, Nigger, a thorough and fascinating study of the etymology of this strange word, he defends Twain's use of the word for literary merit, as have many scholars. This is just one small piece we read in defense of the novel over a 5-day introduction. Today, the introduction is 1 day long. The discussions upon reading the novel, longer and longer and longer. This this year, as we concluded our reading, I asked kids what resources they had used and what commentary they had found outside of the required reading. A dangerous act of permissive behavior. I allowed a kid access to the computer on my desk, which also allows access to the internet and these large screens. Trusting as I am, he called up a site known as thugnotes.com. Now, a clearly intelligent black scholar acting as a black thug stereotype offers hysterical commentary and insightful analysis on this novel. And even though we covered irony from 50 angles in class, I think, oh God, this clip is just racist. Well, we can have that argument. And as a teacher, I am certainly obligated to pursue that argument. But to this generation and the multi-ethnic classrooms of today, those thug notes were both hysterical and educational. And just to make sure, I always encourage honest criticism and anonymous feedback. But in the end, this seems to be my paranoia, not theirs. This generation does not struggle with the issue in the same way as baby boomers. This generation seems not to struggle with the issue as much as the previous generation, the Gen Xers. If anything, the issue seems to befuddle many of them, for good or bad. You can chalk this up to suburban naivete, if you will, perhaps seclusion and inexperience, maybe. But we are moving forward. Believe me, we can, and we must trust this generation on this issue. Merriam-Webster, Dr. King, David Amadio, never get that right. David Amadio, the media, the classroom, the current generation, who's doing the defining here? What is this doing to our brains? We all know the forces that we fight outside the walls of this sanctuary. And they can be overwhelming. Unitarian Universalists define racism through our faith and living our 7 principles. Although racism may be a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race, this definition only provides fodder for our actions. We as individuals and Unitarian Universalists must define racism by fighting racism. We as individuals and Unitarian Universalists must use our heads, our ability to reason, and employ logic and knowledge in our fight against racism, stereotypes, intolerance. We as individuals and Unitarian Universalists have the authority to redefine racism as the fight against racism. Raise your voice. Call out injustice where you see it. Write your political representatives or local paper. Move your feet. VUU offers countless activities to further social justice. We must trust our instincts and our hearts. Our actions help define racism. And our actions are those of love and compassion. While our little amygdalas may evoke fear and our environmental influences may evoke the occasional racial sin, We must navigate the confusion of fear by guiding our mission with the oars of love all. Above all, we must live our 7 principles.